It was at the end of a stifling summer that I decided, along with my friend Lucas, to explore a remote lake we had heard about at a small bar in town. They said the place was paradisiacal, perfect for fishing and disconnecting from the world. Of course, it wasn't on the map. Only the locals knew how to get there. The kind of place that wasn't meant to be found. The road was long and winding, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to close in on the car. The farther we went, the fewer signs of civilization remained. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky a deep orange, and the silence outside was almost oppressive. When we finally arrived, the lake was exactly as they described, a hidden gem. The water, crystal clear and mirror-like, reflected the sky as if it were glass. But something felt off, something I couldn't quite explain, a sense of unease. We quickly set up camp in a small clearing by the water's edge. Lucas was excited, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I didn't say anything so as not to ruin the mood. After preparing the boat and organizing the fishing gear, we rowed to the middle of the lake. The silence was absolute, almost supernatural. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Only the rhythmic sound of the oars slicing through the water broke the stillness. And then we saw him. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark outline among the trees, hard to make out in the dimming light. But there was something unsettling about the way it was positioned. My eyes adjusted to the waning light, and what had initially seemed like a formless blur began to take on frightening details. It was a man. He stood completely still, almost as if he were part of the landscape, tall and thin, with his shoulders slumped forward unnaturally, as if the weight of his own body were a burden. His silhouette stood out among the tree trunks, and even from a distance, he seemed wrong. He wasn't carrying anything. No flashlight, no fishing rod, not even a backpack or anything that might explain his presence there. He was just standing there, watching us. The air grew heavy around us, as if the lake itself were holding its breath. A damp, earthy smell mixed with the acrid scent of decaying leaves filled my nostrils, but this time it nauseated me. My stomach churned as a cold shiver ran down my spine. My heart began to race, each beat echoing in my head like a drum. "Do you see that?" My voice came out in a whisper, a thread of sound barely breaking the oppressive silence around us. Lucas turned slowly, squinting toward the shoreline. He didn't say anything immediately. His breathing grew heavy, and I realized he, too, was trying to process what he was seeing. "Yeah, that's weird. You think it's another fisherman?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant, but the forced tone in his voice betrayed his unease. I swallowed hard. My mouth felt as dry as paper. Even breathing was difficult. "Doesn't look like it," I murmured, my throat tightening. "He's just standing there." And that was the worst part. He wasn't doing anything. He didn't move his hands, didn't take a single step. He was just staring at us, as still as a grotesque statue in the middle of the forest. It didn't make sense. Who would stand like that, hidden in the shadows, in such a remote place? We tried to pretend it didn't bother us, forcing ourselves to focus on fishing, but it was impossible. My gaze kept returning to the shore like a magnet, drawn to the unsettling presence of that man. And he was still there, motionless, his eyes invisible in the darkness, but somehow palpable. I could feel them. The sensation was inescapably watching us. Not casually, but intensely, as if studying our every move. The darkness deepened, spreading like black ink over the lake. The moon appeared in the sky, but its light seemed too faint to protect us. The water, once so calm, now felt heavy, as though something was moving beneath the surface, mirroring our unease. The discomfort turned into pure fear, the kind of fear that clings to your skin like cold sweat, that makes your body want to run even as your mind tries to rationalize. "We should go back," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. Lucas shot me a quick look, nodding without hesitation. Yeah, let's head back to camp. We rowed in silence, each creak of the oars in the water sounding like gunshots in the void. My eyes never left the shore, tracking that man until he vanished into the darkness as we neared our landing point. But even when I couldn't see him anymore, I knew he was still there, watching. As we stepped onto the shore, the smell of the lake damp, almost rotten, seemed stronger. The cold wind rustled through the trees, but it wasn't enough to ease the sticky heat of adrenaline coursing through my body. I turned one last time, staring into the darkness between the trees, waiting or dreading to see that man move. But he remained still, like a shadow rooted to that place, a silent and unbearably present observer. When we reached the shore, the shadow was still there, but it seemed closer now. We could make out his face here, the lack of expression on it. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken and empty, and there was something wrong with his posture, as if his body didn't quite know how to behave. "Let's go to the tent," I said, grabbing Lucas by the arm. We lit a small fire and sat in silence, staring at the flames. I wanted to believe he was just some crazy guy wandering the woods, but something inside me screamed that wasn't it. It was something worse. After a while, Lucas broke the silence. Maybe we should have asked what he wanted. I mean, what if he was just lost? Lost? I replied with a nervous laugh. Then why is he just standing there, staring at us? That's not normal, Lucas. We couldn't relax. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. That's when we heard it. A rhythmic, soft sound broke the night silence. It was faint, almost hypnotic, yet tinged with something deeply wrong, like the ticking of a clock counting down to a sentence. It was coming from the water. My heart raced, and every muscle in my body tensed as if preparing to run. Lucas, already jittery, grabbed the flashlight with trembling hands. The beam of light cut through the lake's darkness, dancing on the still surface until it illuminated something that froze my blood. Ripples, small, steady waves spreading across the water in a measured rhythm. Oars. Someone was approaching. "It's him," Lucas whispered, his voice almost a panicked sob. His eyes were wide, the flashlight shaking so much in his hands that the beam wavered. The oars stopped. Suddenly, the silence was even more terrifying. The sound of the water dissipated like a dark echo, and the lake returned to its eerie stillness, as if holding its breath. We were frozen, our bodies paralyzed by fear. Every tiny noise, the crackle of a dying ember in the fire, the distant rustle of leaves felt deafening. Then we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the shore. Heavy. Each step seemed to sink into the damp earth, drawing closer and closer. I didn't need to look to know. He had left the boat. He was walking toward us now. "We can't stay here anymore," I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of panic. We began packing up in a frenzy, tossing everything into the truck. The wind seemed to grow stronger, fueled by our desperation, and snuffed out the fire in a gust that reeked of damp earth and smoke. When I finally lifted my eyes, a wave of pure terror rooted me to the spot. He was there, standing at the edge of our campsite. His dark silhouette blended with the night, but his outline was solid, threatening. The moonlight cast just enough glow to highlight his thin frame and the unnatural tilt of his head, as if he were studying our every move. The air around me felt heavier, harder to breathe. The sensation of being trapped, exposed, consumed me entirely. He didn't need to move. His mere presence was suffocating. Every cell in my body screamed to run, and I obeyed without hesitation, diving into the car with my heart pounding so violently it felt like it would burst from my chest. Even as we sped down the dirt road, kicking up dust behind us, my mind couldn't let go of the image of him standing there still, unmoving but with eyes I could feel watching me, even if I couldn't see them. We drove off, the dirt road stretching endlessly ahead. I glanced at the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see him emerge from the darkness, but there was nothing. When we finally reached the main road, Lucas broke the silence. "Do you think he's still there?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to think about it. To this day, I can't forget that empty face, those slow, deliberate steps, We never went back to the lake, and yet the feeling of being watched still haunts me. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what we see, it's what we can't understand. My friends and I have always loved exploring trails and camping in isolated places. We've had our share of adventures, but none compare to the weekend we spent in an old cabin deep in the woods. We found the place through a vague online ad cheap and promising exactly what we were looking for: total disconnection from the city and a chance to experience some tranquility in the heart of nature. But that romantic idea quickly turned into the worst nightmare of our lives. The plan was simple. I, Daniel, along with Kevin, Sophia, Mariana, and Benjamin, would spend the weekend at this remote retreat. The ad described the cabin as rustic and secluded, perfect for anyone wanting to escape the world. We left early on Friday, excited and loud, all crammed into Kevin's old SUV. We laughed, listened to music, and swapped stories as the road carried us deeper into the countryside. The scenery began to change. Small towns gave way to open fields, which soon disappeared as we entered the forest. The tall trees formed a natural tunnel, blocking most of the sunlight. The narrow road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the further we drove, the weaker our phone signals became. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. The place looked like something out of a horror movie, an old structure with peeling paint, dirty windows, and a crooked porch that creaked at the slightest touch. The overgrown weeds around it seemed almost eager to swallow the house whole. A cold wind passed through us, carrying the smell of rotting wood and damp earth. "Well, cozy, isn't it?" Kevin tried to joke, but his voice sounded nervous. We forced a laugh, all feeling the same unease. No one wanted to be the first to admit that the place was unsettling. With our backpacks on, we climbed the creaky porch steps and entered the cabin. Inside, it was even worse. The furniture was old and dusty. The wooden floors groaned with every step, and a strong smell of mildew hung in the air. The tiny kitchen had appliances so outdated they seemed from another decade. In the living room, a faded couch and a few chairs faced a stone fireplace that dominated the space. A wooden staircase led to two tiny bedrooms upstairs. Everything about the place felt abandoned. As we unpacked, an oppressive silence filled the cabin. It was a strange kind of silence that made every small sound the zipper of a backpack. The creak of the floor seemed deafening. I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there, like we were trespassing. Night fell quickly, and we tried to distract ourselves. Kevin and I lit the fireplace while Sophia and Mariana organized the small kitchen. Dinner was simple: sausages and canned beans, something that should have been comforting but barely felt edible. We sat around the fireplace, but the conversation was strained, full of awkward silences. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all on edge. After dinner, we decided to explore the area before total darkness set in. The forest was dense, with trees so tall they blocked any remaining light from the sky. The air felt heavier there, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, set our nerves on edge. That's when we found something that made us freeze. A small cemetery hidden among the trees. The gravestones were old, many covered in moss and nearly illegible, but it was clear they had been there for a long time. There was no path or house nearby, just those forgotten graves in the middle of nowhere. Well, now it makes sense why the cabin was so cheap. Nobody caught that in the ad? Mariana tried to joke, her voice forced and a bit too high-pitched. "Nothing like a cemetery to scare off tenants," I muttered, trying to sound casual. We hurried back to the cabin, our unease turning into something closer to fear. We tried to relax by playing cards and telling stories, but the atmosphere felt different. The flickering firelight cast strange shadows on the walls, making the old furniture seem even more distorted. Every noise, the wind against the windows, the crackling fire, set our hearts racing. And then we heard it. A sound coming from outside, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind or a branch breaking. It was something moving. Footsteps, slowly circling the cabin. Each sound felt deliberate, calculated, as if it wanted to draw our attention, as if it knew we were listening. The noise would stop for a few seconds, only to start again, louder, closer. The room fell into a crushing silence. Our eyes met, but no one said a word. The panic in the air was almost tangible. weighing down on us. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it echoed in my ears. "Did you hear that?" My voice came out shaky, almost inaudible. Kevin nodded slowly, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the fireplace. His expression was pale, lips slightly parted as if he were about to say something but couldn't. "It's probably just an animal," he finally murmured, but the tension in his voice betrayed the fact that he didn't believe his own words. The footsteps continued, clearer now, almost within reach of the door. It felt as though whoever was outside wanted us to know it was there. It wasn't trying to hide. On the contrary, it seemed to be toying with us, testing our limits. A chill swept through my body, every muscle locked in growing terror. I grabbed the flashlight with trembling hands, feeling cold sweat run down my back. "I am going to check what it is." Sophia gasped and grabbed my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. "Are you crazy? You are not going out there." But Kevin, in a burst of courage or stupidity, stood up. "I'll go with you." We walked toward the door like we were marching to our doom. Each step echoed through the room, the creaking floorboards sounding unbearably loud. When my hand touched the doorknob, a shiver ran down my spine. I turned it slowly, and the door creaked open like a warning scream. The air outside was icy, sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The flashlight cast a beam of light into the darkness, illuminating the porch steps and the clearing around the cabin. My eyes scanned every shadow, every corner. Nothing. No footprints in the muddy ground, no movement in the trees. Just oppressive emptiness and the suffocating feeling that we were being watched. "There's nothing here," Kevin whispered, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. We shut the door quickly, locking it as if that could somehow protect us. Back in the living room, the atmosphere was unbearable. The warmth of the fireplace couldn't reach our bodies, frozen by fear. No one spoke as we laid down near the fire, huddling together like frightened children seeking comfort. And then the sound returned. This time, it came from above. The footsteps were slow but unmistakable. Every creak of the attic floor sounded like thunder in the silence of the cabin. My body froze, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if I could see through the old wood. The sound moved back and forth, as if someone or something was pacing from one room to another. "Someone's upstairs," Mariana whispered, her voice barely audible. She clutched Sophia's arm, both of them trembling like leaves in the wind. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse and suffocating. I could hear the erratic, rapid thudding of my own heartbeat, a drum in the chaos. And then, they started again. Slowly, deliberately, the steps moved toward the top of the staircase. Each floorboard creaked as if protesting against the weight pressing down on it. They stopped there, lingering for what felt like an eternity. And then they began to descend. Slowly, one step at a time. The sound of old wood groaning under the weight was almost unbearable. I couldn't breathe. My lungs refused to pull in air. It felt like the very room was crushing us, holding us in place. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there. But my body wouldn't obey. All I could do was stare at the staircase, waiting, dreading the moment when we'd see whatever was coming down. Panic took over. I jumped to my feet, my whole body shaking. "We need to leave, now." No one hesitated. We grabbed whatever we could carry and bolted outside. The cold air bit at our faces as we piled into the SUV. When Kevin finally managed to start the car, I glanced back one last time. The cabin door was open, swaying in the wind, and standing in the doorway was a shadowy figure watching us, motionless. I don't know if that figure was really there, or if my mind, shattered by everything that had happened, conjured it up. But one thing is certain: the sounds, the fear, and everything we endured in that cursed cabin were real, horribly real. We sped off, tires screeching, leaving the cabin and that nightmare behind. But to this day, every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the footsteps descending the stairs, coming closer and closer. It was horrifying. I've been working as a surveyor for almost 20 years. During that time, I've been to some of the most remote and inhospitable places you can imagine. I've faced wild animals, sudden storms, and even equipment failures in completely isolated areas. But nothing I'd experienced prepared me for what happened under that bridge in the Arizona backcountry. It was mid-July, and the desert heat felt like it was trying to melt everything around. The sky was clear, an intense blue, with not a single cloud offering shade. The job that day was straightforward: inspect an old bridge built over a dry riverbed more than 50 kilometers from any major city. It wasn't glamorous work, but I enjoyed the solitude. The road to the site was narrow and dusty. My truck kicked up red clouds as I drove, surrounded only by cacti and gnarled shrubs. The radio picked up nothing but static, but I didn't mind. In that oppressive silence, the sound of my own thoughts was company enough. When I reached the bridge, the sun was already at its peak, scorching my skin like burning coals. The concrete structure was cracked and covered in years of accumulated dust. It was obvious no one had been through there in a long time. I grabbed my equipment and started the inspection. Everything seemed normal until I noticed something strange. Under the bridge's shadow, partially hidden by the central pillar, was a large metal container, one of those big ones used for trash. It was rusty, covered in graffiti and grime. The strangest part was the smell, a sour, putrid stench that grew stronger the closer I got. My instincts told me to ignore it, but curiosity won out. When I lifted the container's lid, a chill ran down my spine. Inside were piles of torn clothes, filthy blankets, and remnants of food packaging. But what truly froze my blood were the drawings etched into the inner walls. Twisted human figures, contorted bodies, and symbols I'd never seen before. I stepped back, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Probably a homeless person using it as a shelter, I thought, trying to convince myself it was something mundane. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. As I finished my inspection, I heard footsteps, light but unmistakable, on the gravel. My body froze and the sound grew closer. When I turned around, I saw a figure emerging from the container's shadows. It was a man, tall, thin, with sun-weathered skin and disheveled hair. His clothes were dirty and tattered. But what terrified me most were his eyes, empty, almost lifeless, but with an insane glint that seemed to pierce my soul. "This is my place," he said, his voice raspy and dragged out, as if he hadn't spoken in days. My heart raced. "I am sorry," I replied, trying to stay calm. "I am just doing my job. I'll be on my way." But he kept moving closer. His steps were slow, deliberate, and his hands trembled as if he were on the verge of losing control. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his twisted smile sending chills down my spine. My mind raced. I knew I couldn't turn my back on him, but I also knew I needed to get out of there. My truck was parked just a few meters away, but he was between me and my only escape. With my heart pounding like a drum, I reached for the revolver I always carried for isolated locations. Pointing it at him, my hand shook so much I could barely keep the gun steady. "Stop, don't come any closer," I shouted, trying to sound firm, but my voice wavered. The man stopped. For a moment, I thought he might back away, but then he tilted his head and let out a low, dark laugh. "You think that'll save you?" he murmured, taking another step forward. "Out here, no one can save you." That was enough for me. I pulled the trigger, firing a shot into the ground near his feet. The sound echoed through the empty desert, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he just smiled wider, as if he knew something I didn't. Without waiting another second, I bolted toward the truck. Terror consumed me, and each step felt like a monumental effort. I reached the door, climbed in, and started the engine. my hands still trembling. When I looked in the rearview mirror, he was standing there, watching, with that unsettling smile frozen on his face. I hit the accelerator and left the bridge behind, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back until I was miles away. I never returned to that place. I reported the incident to my supervisor but requested never to be sent to such isolated areas again. To this day, I avoid thinking about what might have happened if I'd hesitated even a second longer. The man's face still haunts my dreams, and that smile, that twisted smile, has never left my memory. Now, every time I am alone in a remote place, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see those empty eyes and that haunting presence again. Because when you are in the middle of nowhere, completely alone, you realize danger can be where you least expect it. After hours of driving down a deserted country road, I was already exhausted. The last signs of civilization had vanished miles ago, leaving only the sound of tires on asphalt and the yellow glow of headlights cutting through the darkness. My goal was to reach a small town called Consequences before nightfall, but the road seemed endless. That's when I saw the sign. An old board with faded letters and flickering lights read, "Horizonte Inn Rooms Available." I sighed in relief. It wasn't an inviting place, but it was better than continuing to drive at night. The building was small and plain, with peeling paint and windows fogged up from decades of grime. There were only 2 cars in the parking lot, and the reception light flickered intermittently. I grabbed my backpack and stepped inside. The musty smell in the lobby was suffocating. Behind the counter stood an old man with thin hair and sunken eyes, staring at me without expression. He seemed more like a shadow than a real person. "I need a room for the night," I said, trying to sound casual. The man stayed silent for several seconds, too long before opening a guest book and sliding a pen toward me. "Sign here," he said in a low, guttural voice. I signed without hesitation, eager to rest. He handed me a rusty key with the number 7 etched unevenly into it. "Don't smoke in the room, and keep the curtains closed," he added, his cold tone sending a shiver down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, but he said nothing more. Taking the key, I headed to the room. Room 7 was at the end of the hallway, near a broken window that let in cold, damp air. When I opened the door, a rancid smell enveloped me. The room was small and decrepit, with a sagging mattress, a side table covered in ring stains, and thin curtains that barely blocked the light from an outside lamp. I was too tired to complain. I lay on the bed, trying to ignore the discomfort, and closed my eyes. But the silence was unsettling. It was so thick it felt like it was pressing down on my chest. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a noise. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, like something or someone lightly tapping on the door. My heart raced. Maybe it was the wind, I thought, though there hadn't been any strong breeze when I arrived. I got up slowly, every movement weighted with anxiety. Taking hesitant steps, I approached the door. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling, barely a whisper. The tapping stopped. I waited a few seconds, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in the room. I decided to open the door, expecting to find nothing but the empty hallway. But that's not what I saw. On the ground, just inches from the threshold, was a set of wet footprints, as if someone barefoot had just passed through. They led from outside but stopped right where I stood. I slammed the door shut and turned the lock, fear coursing through my veins. Rushing back to the bed, I tried to rationalize it. "It's just my imagination," I told myself. Then came another sound. This time, it was from the window. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came again, persistent, almost mocking my fear. Each tap seemed to echo directly in my mind, slow, deliberate, as if whatever was on the other side wanted to make sure I knew it was there. My breathing grew heavier, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. For a moment, I froze on the bed, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, a branch maybe, or the old inn creaking. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This was something. What? The tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. My hands trembled so much that it took 2 tries to grab my phone. I turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Every shadow cast on the wall seemed to shift, distorted. My instinct screamed at me not to approach the window, but curiosity or sheer terror pushed me forward. Step by step, I moved, my feet sinking into the damp, musty carpet. When I reached the curtain, I noticed it swayed slightly, as if a cold breath had just passed through. With the flashlight shaking in my hand, I reached out with the other to pull the curtain aside. Tap, tap, tap. My hand froze inches from the fabric. I could swear I heard a faint sound, like slow, heavy breathing on the other side of the glass. With every second I hesitated, the presence beyond the window felt more oppressive, more tangible, as if it were pressing closer. I took a deep breath, my throat tightening. Just open it, just look. It's nothing. That's what I told myself, but I knew I was lying. I yanked the curtain back in one motion, and what I saw made my body freeze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. A figure was outside, but it wasn't just a figure. A pale, almost translucent face was pressed against the glass. The skin seemed stretched too tightly over the bones, thin as paper, nearly transparent in the dim light of my phone. The eyes were deep, black voids, as if they absorbed all light around them. They stared at me, unblinking, fixed. The mouth was twisted into a crooked grin, so wide it looked like it might split the face in two. But the worst part was the movement. Slowly, as it stared, that grin stretched even wider, revealing rows of thin, yellowed, impossibly long teeth. My phone almost slipped from my hand as I stumbled back, tripping over the bed and crashing to the floor. The impact was hard, but I barely felt it. My mind was in absolute panic, my eyes glued to that thing. Then it began to move. The face pressed against the glass started to tilt, first to one side, then the other, as if it were studying me. Then, as though taunting me, the head began to tilt in an unnatural way, until it was completely upside down. I screamed. I don't know how, but my scream echoed so loudly it drowned out the sound of my own heartbeat. I blinked for a split second and it was gone. I shot to my feet, driven by sheer desperation. Grabbing my backpack, I bolted for the door, my only escape. I twisted the doorknob violently, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut with an unrelenting force, like the door had been welded to the frame. "Let me out!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "Let me out!" That's when I heard it. A laugh. It wasn't loud or hysterical. It was low, drawn out, as if coming from someplace deep and cavernous. A laugh that mocked my helplessness, reverberating through the room like a whisper multiplying into echoes. When I looked back at the window, I saw something that made me abandon any attempt at rationality. The glass was completely covered in handprints. They were everywhere, small, large, some distorted and elongated, as though they belonged to something not human. I don't remember how I escaped. My body moved on pure instinct. All I recall is running down the dark hallway, stumbling over my own feet. The overwhelming feeling that something was right behind me. When I reached the car, I turned the key with trembling hands. The engine sputtered for what felt like an eternity before roaring to life. As I drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The figure was there, standing by the window of room 7, watching as I disappeared into the darkness of the road. I never went back to that place, but every night when the silence stretches too long, I hear the sound again. Tap, tap, tap.
If you enjoyed these horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share with your friends. Thank you so much for being here, and see you next time, where the fear never sleeps.